Welcome to the Sleepy Scholar, where curious minds drift off to fascinating facts and the world's greatest mysteries and conspiracies. Before you settle in, be sure to like and follow so you can continue to explore the world's most puzzling mysteries and conspiracies on Earth. Tonight, we journey to the easternmost tip of Long Island, New York, to a rusting radar tower standing watch over the Atlantic, where some say the government once tore holes in time itself. This is the Montauk Project. So settle in, relax, and let your curiosity drift into the dark. This is the Sleepy Scholar. The land at the center of tonight's story has a long, entirely real military history stretching back further than most people realize. The site's strategic value at the easternmost point of Long Island was recognized as far back as the American Revolution. But its modern story begins in 1942, when the U.S. Army built Camp Hero as a coastal defense installation, intended to protect the New York region from a feared German naval assault. The base was constructed with a deliberate disguise. Barracks, gun emplacements, and command buildings were designed to resemble an ordinary small fishing village from the air and sea, complete with fake building facades, painted windows, and even a decorative church steeple concealing military hardware underneath. Massive 16-inch coastal artillery guns were installed and test-fired throughout the war, producing concussive blasts locals still recall rattling windows in downtown Montauk decades later. Guns that, despite years of readiness, never once fired at an actual enemy target. The Army decommissioned the artillery batteries in 1947, cut the massive guns apart for scrap, and left most of the surrounding infrastructure simply abandoned to the salt air. The base's second life began in 1951, when the Air Force's 773rd Air Control and Warning Squadron reactivated it as the Montauk Air Force Station, shifting its mission from coastal artillery entirely toward Cold War radar surveillance. The base became one node in the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment Network, known as SAGE, a real, extensively documented system of interconnected radar stations built across North America specifically to detect incoming Soviet bomber attacks and feed tracking data into early computerized defense systems. In 1958, the base was fitted with its now iconic feature, a massive and /FPS 35 radar dish, roughly 126 feet across and mounted atop a purpose-built tower, capable of sweeping the Atlantic approach to the entire New York region for early warning of an aerial attack that, fortunately, never came. The base's operational life ended in 1981, when it was permanently decommissioned, and its land was transferred to New York State in 1984, though the property didn't formally open to the public as Camp Hero State Park until 2002, a gap of nearly 2 decades during which the abandoned base sat closed, overgrown, and effectively unsupervised. Exactly the kind of setting that tends to gather rumor around it in the absence of any public information at all. It's worth knowing plainly, before we go any further into tonight's mythology, that former personnel who were actually stationed at the base during its operational years have since gone on record describing entirely ordinary, unremarkable service there. One veteran who lived on base in the early 1970s later wrote simply that the elaborate Montauk Project legend was, in his words, total fabrication, describing a workaday existence of cooks, radar technicians, and base exchange clerks rather than anything resembling classified paranormal research. That absence of any confirmed extraordinary activity hasn't stopped this particular site from becoming, arguably, the second most famous alleged secret base in American conspiracy culture, trailing only Area 51 itself. And unlike Area 51, whose mythology grew primarily out of aircraft sightings and a single disputed 1989 television interview, the Montauk Project's origin story required an entirely separate legend to be manufactured first, one that predates Camp Hero's own conspiracy reputation by nearly 3 decades, and that will spend the remainder of this hour tracing all the way back to its true beginning. To understand where the Montauk Project's mythology actually came from, we need to go back nearly 40 years before Preston Nichols ever wrote a word about Camp Hero, to a much older legend that would eventually be grafted onto it, the Philadelphia experiment. The story holds that in October 1943, the U.S. Navy fitted the destroyer escort USS Eldridge with powerful electromagnetic generators at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, attempting to render the ship invisible to enemy radar. According to the legend, the experiment went catastrophically further than intended. The Eldridge didn't just vanish from radar, it reportedly disappeared entirely from visual observation, teleported roughly 200 miles to Norfolk, Virginia, and back again within minutes, and left its crew in horrifying condition. Some driven insane, others, in the story's most gruesome detail, said to have been fused directly into the ship's metal bulkheads. Here's the part that matters most, and it's worth stating plainly. This story did not originate from any Navy record, veteran testimony, or declassified document. It originated entirely from a series of letters. In January 1955, an astronomer and UFO researcher named Morris K. Jessup, who held a genuine master's degree in astronomy and had recently published a best-selling book called The Case for the UFO, received an unsolicited letter from a man calling himself Carlos Miguel Allende, later revealed to be a Pennsylvania man named Carl Meredith Allen. The letters were, by every surviving account, strange even on their own terms, erratically capitalized, randomly underlined, filled with invented terminology, and claiming that Allende had personally witnessed the Eldridge's disappearance while serving aboard a nearby merchant ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth, and that he had subsequently been personally tutored in unified field theory by Albert Einstein himself. Allende continued corresponding with Jessup through 1956, all 50-some letters growing progressively stranger, without ever providing verifiable documentation, consistent dates, or corroborating witnesses beyond his own account. The story might have ended there, as one eccentric man's letters to a skeptical author, if not for what happened next. In 1957, officers from the Office of Naval Research contacted Jessup after receiving a package containing a copy of his own book, annotated throughout in 3 distinct handwriting styles, discussing the Philadelphia experiment in elaborate, cryptic detail. For reasons that have never been fully explained, 2 ONR officers arranged for a small number of copies of this annotated book, now known among researchers as the Vero edition, after the private contractor that printed it, to be produced and distributed. This official, if minor, government engagement with the material is precisely what gave Allende's otherwise unverifiable claims a lasting appearance of legitimacy, even though the ONR's own involvement never amounted to validating the underlying story, only to puzzling over a strange package it had received. The actual historical record contradicts the legend at nearly every point that can be checked. The Navy's own official information sheet on the incident states plainly that no such experiment was ever conducted, and that details of the story directly contradict well-established facts about the Eldridge's actual wartime service record and location during the period in question. Naval historian Edward Dudgeon, who served aboard a genuinely nearby ship, the USS Engstrom, in dry dock at the same shipyard, has explained what he believes seeded the myth. Both vessels were fitted with real, unclassified degaussing equipment, a standard wartime technique that used electromagnetic coils to neutralize a ship's magnetic signature, protecting it from magnetically triggered naval mines. A genuine technology that had absolutely nothing to do with invisibility or teleportation, but whose electromagnetic nature made it an easy seed for later, wilder storytelling. UFO researcher Jacques Vallée, examining the case decades later, proposed that the entire legend likely grew from a combination of this real degaussing work, ordinary and unremarkable rapid naval ship movements between East Coast ports that observers may have misunderstood, and possibly a genuine atmospheric electrical phenomenon like St. Elmo's fire, misremembered and combined into an entirely new story by the time it reached Allende's letters more than a decade later. Morris Jessup's own story ended in a way that, unfortunately, gave this legend even more staying power than the Vero edition alone ever could have. By 1958, his personal life had deteriorated substantially. His wife had left him. He had been involved in a serious car accident from which he recovered slowly, and friends who knew him during this period described him as increasingly unstable and depressed, having discussed suicide with acquaintances for months beforehand. On April 20th, 1959, Jessup was found dead in his car at a park in Dade County, Florida. The official determination, following medical examination, was suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. It's worth noting that Jessup had reportedly written what one contemporary described as an outright suicide letter to a friend just days earlier, and had a documented history of depression and professional despondency stretching back years, including frustration at being unable to interest mainstream science in his research. Conspiracy theorists have disputed the official finding ever since, pointing to details including the absence of any formal autopsy in some accounts, a missing briefcase that reportedly contained notes he'd been working on, and the fact that he had scheduled a meeting for the very next day with a colleague to share what he described as a breakthrough regarding the Philadelphia experiment. It's worth stating clearly, out of respect for the seriousness of the subject, where the actual documented evidence stands. No credible investigation has ever produced physical evidence of foul play. No third-party involvement was ever documented at the scene, and Jessup's history of depression in the months leading up to his death is independently corroborated by multiple people who knew him. Whatever private torment may have led to that night, his death effectively ended his own involvement in the story. But by then the Philadelphia experiment myth had already taken on a life entirely independent of him, filtering through UFO research circles for decades, occasionally resurfacing in books and a widely watched 1984 science fiction film adaptation, before it would eventually collide with an entirely separate legend forming 300 miles north, on the eastern tip of Long Island. That collision happened through one man, Preston B. Nichols was a real, credentialed electrical engineer from Long Island who, by his own account, spent the 1970s and early 1980s working in what he called the psychotronics field, the study of using electronic devices to influence human consciousness. In 1992, Nichols published the Montauk Project, Experiments in Time, co-written with Peter Moon, in which he claimed to have recovered previously suppressed memories of having personally participated in classified experiments conducted at Camp Hero throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Crucially, Nichols and Moon opened their own book with a line that has since been widely quoted by researchers examining the case. Whether you read this as science fiction or nonfiction, you are in for an amazing story. A deliberate ambiguity that several analysts have since identified as the book's single most durable strategic asset, allowing it to be marketed and consumed simultaneously as either literal nonfiction or speculative entertainment, depending entirely on what any given reader wanted it to be. According to Nichols's account, the Montauk Project grew directly out of the same electromagnetic research, supposedly behind the Philadelphia experiment 2 decades earlier, with scientists relocating and refining their techniques at Camp Hero specifically because the base's massive SAGE radar tower offered exactly the kind of high-powered electromagnetic infrastructure needed to continue the work. The bridge connecting these two otherwise separate mythologies by 4 decades and 300 miles arrived in the form of a man calling himself Bielek, who claimed, after watching the 1984 Philadelphia experiment film, to have experienced a sudden flood of recovered memories revealing that his real name was actually Edward Cameron, that he had personally served aboard the Eldridge in 1943, and that he had subsequently been thrown forward through time to 1983, landing at Camp Hero and becoming absorbed directly into the Montauk Project already underway there. It's a narrative bridge built almost entirely out of one man's self-reported memories, recovered specifically after watching a work of commercial fiction about the very event those memories supposedly recalled. A detail that will matter a great deal as we examine the rest of what Nichols and Bielek went on to claim. According to Preston Nichols's account, the centerpiece of the entire Montauk Project was a device he called the Montauk Chair, a seat wired with electromagnetic sensors that, he claimed, could detect and dramatically amplify a person's psychic energy, translating focused thought into measurable, even physical, real-world effects. Nichols claimed the chair's effectiveness depended almost entirely on finding the right operator, and that a man named Duncan Cameron, who, in a detail Nichols and Moon presented as remarkable coincidence, was reportedly related to the very same Cameron family Bielek claimed as his true identity from the 1943 Eldridge experiment, possessed unusually powerful natural psychic ability, allowing him to sit in the chair and, according to the claims, mentally manifest physical objects and stabilize what Nichols described as tunnels through space and time itself. Nichols asserted that by 1980s, the project scientists had modified the base's real, physically massive and /FPS 35 radar array to broadcast at specific frequencies between 410 and 420 megahertz, generating electromagnetic fields strong enough, in his account, to tear open literal portals connecting different points in time. He claimed these portals could be aimed at specific historical coordinates, including a direct link back to 1943 and the original Philadelphia experiment, with Duncan Cameron's psychic focus serving as the stabilizing force holding each tunnel open long enough for supposed travel to occur. Bielek's own testimony builds directly on this framework, describing his claimed 1983 arrival at Camp Hero via exactly this kind of temporal portal, followed by his subsequent recruitment into the ongoing project he said was already well underway by the time he supposedly arrived. The claims extended well beyond time travel alone. Nichols alleged that the project's true purpose eventually shifted toward psychological warfare and mind control, using the same electromagnetic technology to implant thoughts, erase memories, and manipulate emotional states in test subjects, several of whom, according to the most disturbing versions of the story, were children specifically selected from vulnerable backgrounds, orphans, runaways, and children of parents struggling with addiction, precisely because their disappearance would be less likely to draw sustained attention or investigation. According to Nichols, once the project was finally shut down in the early 1980s amid fears its own experiments had grown dangerously unstable, the underground levels beneath Camp Hero's buildings were deliberately flooded with concrete to permanently seal them off. A man named Stuart Swerdlow later added his own testimony to this same body of claims, telling a British newspaper interview in 2017 that he had personally been one of the so-called Montauk boys, Nichols described, subjected to severe psychological and physical abuse as part of the same alleged program, and specifically corroborating the claim that expendable, vulnerable children were deliberately targeted for recruitment into the experiments. Like Nichols and Bielek before him, Swerdlow's account rests entirely on his own personal testimony, offered decades after the alleged events, without any independent documentary corroboration, medical record, or named third-party witness capable of confirming the specific claims involved. It's worth pausing here to note something structurally important about how each piece of this testimony arrived. Nichols described recovering his own memories gradually, over time, while after the alleged events supposedly occurred. Bielek's memories reportedly surfaced suddenly, triggered specifically by watching a fictional film about the very experiment he claimed to remember. Swerdlow's account followed a similar pattern, emerging only after Nichols's own book had already been published and widely circulated. This sequence, each successive witness's memories surfacing only after being exposed to an earlier person's already public account, is precisely the pattern psychologists studying recovered memory phenomena flag as most consistent with confabulation, a well-documented process in which a sincere person's mind constructs detailed, emotionally vivid memories that feel entirely genuine but were substantially shaped, consciously or not, by external suggestion rather than by direct, unprompted recollection of an actual lived experience. Nichols's mind control claims didn't emerge into a culture with no reason to take them seriously, and it's worth understanding exactly why, because the real history here is genuinely disturbing in its own right, without requiring any invented radar tower at all. Project MKUltra was a real, extensively declassified CIA program, running officially from 1953 to 1973, dedicated to researching mind control and behavioral modification techniques, primarily as a Cold War response to fears that communist adversaries had developed their own methods of controlling human thought. Over its two-decade run, the program encompassed 149 separate documented subprojects conducted across universities, hospitals, and prisons, including facilities in Canada, using experimental methods ranging from administering LSD and other psychoactive drugs to sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and electroshock, frequently administered to unwitting subjects, including hospital patients, prison inmates, and in at least one documented instance involving federal narcotics agent George White. Ordinary citizens dosed with LSD in CIA-run safe houses without their knowledge or consent, justified internally as necessary for national security research. The program's oversight was genuinely minimal even by the CIA's own later admission. A subsequent CIA Inspector General review concluded that many of MKUltra's individual experiments made little scientific sense and were conducted by researchers with scant medical expertise or institutional oversight. A 1977 Senate inquiry, the Church Committee, found that at least one death resulted directly from these activities, and separately documented covert drug testing on unwitting citizens across multiple social levels. Perhaps most tellingly for how much of this history we'll ever fully understand. In 1973, then CIA Director Richard Helms, anticipating that congressional scrutiny was imminent, personally ordered the destruction of the program's central files, and boxes of MKUltra documentation were shredded or burned specifically to erase the paper trail of 2 decades of activity. It was only in 1977, through a Freedom of Information Act request, that investigators recovered a separate cache of roughly 20,000 financial and administrative documents that had, apparently by accident, escaped that deliberate destruction, records detailed enough to confirm the program's disturbing scope. Even though the full extent of what actually happened under MKUltra likely will never be completely reconstructed, precisely because its own director made sure of that. This is worth sitting with directly, because it changes how we should weigh Nichols's claims about Camp Hero. The United States government spent 2 full decades, using genuine taxpayer funding, running real, documented, unethical experiments testing exactly the categories of mind control Nichols would later claim were happening at Montauk: electromagnetic and pharmacological manipulation of human consciousness, memory, and behavior, conducted on unwitting subjects, with senior officials later moving deliberately to destroy the evidence. Anyone encountering the Montauk Project's claims in the 1990s, several years after MKUltra's existence had already become public knowledge through the Church Committee hearings, would have had genuine, well-founded reason to believe that this kind of government program was entirely plausible, because a version of it demonstrably had actually happened. It just hadn't happened at Camp Hero, using time portals with a chair that read psychic energy. It happened in ordinary hospitals and university laboratories, using drugs and electroshock, and its own director tried to make sure most of us would never know exactly how far it went. No account of this mythology would be complete without Nikola Tesla, and it's worth separating, clearly, what actually happened to him from what the legend later claimed. Tesla, the real, celebrated inventor behind alternating current power and early wireless transmission research, died alone in his room at the New Yorker Hotel on January 7, 1943, at the age of 86, with the New York Medical Examiner determining the cause of death as coronary thrombosis. What happened immediately afterward is genuinely documented and genuinely strange in its own right. Because Tesla had been born in what was then the Austrian Empire, the U.S. government's Office of Alien Property Custodian seized his personal papers and belongings almost immediately, justified at the time by wartime concerns that his research, including his own claims about a theoretical death ray weapon, might contain information valuable to the nation's enemies if it fell into the wrong hands. An MIT electrical engineer named John G. Trump, coincidentally the uncle of a future American president, was brought in to formally evaluate the seized papers and reported that Tesla's later writings were, in his professional assessment, primarily speculative and philosophical in character, containing no sound, workable new scientific principles. The FBI didn't declassify a substantial portion of its Tesla-related files until 2016, with additional smaller releases following in 2018, and some material connected to the case reportedly remains unaccounted for even now. A genuine, documented gap that has fueled decades of legitimate historical curiosity about exactly what Tesla was working on in his final years, entirely independent of anything involving Montauk. The conspiracy version goes considerably further. According to claims that have circulated for years within Montauk Project retellings, Tesla's 1943 death was actually faked, and the real Tesla secretly relocated to Long Island decades later, eventually emerging in the 1970s to serve as the Montauk Project's chief scientific director. A claim that would have required him to be well over 120 years old by the time the alleged experiments were said to be underway. This specific claim illustrates something worth carrying forward into the rest of tonight's episode. Unlike the genuinely documented Tesla history involving real government seizure and real declassification gaps, the claim of his faked death and secret leadership role at Camp Hero has no supporting evidence of any kind and represents one of the clearer examples, within this entire mythology, of a real historical figure's genuine, unresolved mystery being used as raw material to construct an entirely separate, unrelated fabrication. Beyond the Montauk Chair and the claimed time tunnels, the broader mythology surrounding this project has accumulated a genuinely remarkable range of additional claims over the 3 decades since Nichols's original book, worth cataloging in full simply to understand the sheer scale of what this legend eventually grew into. Some retellings describe the facility eventually expanding to as many as 12 distinct levels, most of them underground, employing several hundred workers at its peak, considerably larger than even Nichols's original claims. Various accounts describe a 50-foot titanium structure shaped like a ziggurat somewhere on the property, its purpose never clearly explained even within the mythology itself. Some versions claim the facility extended in tunnels reaching beneath the town of Montauk proper, connected via high-speed maglev transit to a wider network of other alleged secret installations, sometimes called deep underground military bases, or DUMBs. The same broad category of claim examined in an earlier episode of this series covering Dulce Base, and worth noting as a recurring structural feature across multiple, otherwise unrelated conspiracy mythologies. A hidden tunnel network is almost always alleged to connect whichever secret facility is currently being discussed to every other one. More disturbing claims allege that homeless individuals were specifically recruited or abducted as test subjects for the project's electromagnetic experiments, with some retellings claiming that most subjects exposed to the most intense radiation blasts did not survive the process. Separately, some versions of the mythology claim the project was responsible for developing the HIV virus in a laboratory setting, and that early experimental flying saucer technology was tested on the property as well. Perhaps the single strangest claim in the entire catalog holds that Bielek and Duncan Cameron, upon supposedly leaping from the Eldridge during its 1943 disappearance, encountered the real mathematician and physicist John von Neumann at Camp Hero. Despite von Neumann having genuinely, verifiably died in 1957, decades before the alleged 1983 encounter this claim describes. Additional claims describe the project creating an organized Men in Black corps specifically tasked with intimidating and confusing witnesses to any of the project's activities, along with the deliberate use of large-scale subliminal messaging campaigns aimed at the general public. And in a detail that ties this entire mythology back to the broader genre this series has already explored in depth, some retellings claim the project also achieved successful contact with extraterrestrial beings, folding the Montauk story directly into the same UFO conspiracy ecosystem already examined through Area 51 and Dulce Base earlier in this series. It's worth stepping back to notice something about the sheer volume and specificity of claims cataloged here. Very few genuine historical conspiracies, even the real documented ones this series has examined, like MKUltra, accumulate this particular pattern. Claims that keep expanding in scale and strangeness with each retelling, incorporating real historical figures in ways that are chronologically impossible, and drawing in essentially every other popular conspiracy theme circulating at the same time, from UFOs to secret diseases to hidden tunnel networks. That pattern of continuous, unconstrained expansion is itself a meaningful signal, distinct from the actual evidentiary status of any single claim within it. This legend's most significant modern cultural legacy arrived not through a documentary or another self-published book, but through one of the most successful television series of the streaming era, and the connection is a good deal more direct than most viewers realize. Brothers Matt and Ross Duffer, while researching the Philadelphia experiment for a school documentary project, encountered the Montauk Project mythology and, in their own words, became genuinely obsessed with it, later describing it in their original pitch materials as one of the most bizarre conspiracy theories in American history. Their first pitch to Netflix wasn't set in the fictional town of Hawkins, Indiana, at all. It was titled simply Montauk, set in the real Long Island town in the fall of 1980, built around a Camp Hero experiment that had gone wrong and released something dangerous into the surrounding community. The show's connections to Nichols's specific claims run deeper than the general premise alone. An early logline for the project, developed under the working title The Montauk Experiment, included a character version of Duncan Cameron himself, described as accidentally unleashing a monstrous being from his own subconscious onto the town, a direct parallel to the eventual show's plot, in which the psychic child 11 unleashes the interdimensional Demogorgon. The show retained a conspiracy-obsessed hermit investigator character, clearly modeled on real-life Montauk Project researchers who spent years examining Camp Hero's abandoned grounds. And the show's eventual villain, Dr. Brenner, was conceived around a backstory involving his father's own disappearance during an experiment that teleported a ship to an alternate dimension, leaving him permanently altered and driven to understand what had happened, a narrative structure drawing directly from Bielek's own Philadelphia experiment origin story. The Duffer brothers ultimately relocated the show's setting to the fictional Midwestern town of Hawkins for practical production reasons. Actor David Harbour has recounted being told the shift happened partly because filming in and around Long Island through an actual winter season would have proven logistically difficult, and renamed the project Stranger Things shortly before its 2016 premiere. That change didn't end the story's connection to real-world controversy, however. In April 2018, a filmmaker named Charlie Kessler filed a lawsuit against the Duffer Brothers, alleging that he had personally discussed his own unproduced screenplay, also titled The Montauk Project and independently based on the same underlying conspiracy legend, with the brothers at a film festival premiere party in 2014, and that they had subsequently used his ideas without credit or compensation. The Duffers disputed this account directly, producing emails reportedly dating back to 2010, several years before their described conversation with Kessler, already outlining their own concept for a show based on the Montauk Project conspiracy. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed, but it remains a genuinely unusual footnote in television history. A real legal dispute over creative ownership of a story, itself based entirely on an unverified 1992 conspiracy book about a secret government project that has never been confirmed to have existed at all. Camp Hero itself has become something of a pilgrimage site as a direct result of the show's success, drawing visitors specifically hoping to experience the same eerie atmosphere depicted in Hawkins' lab visitors touring the actual, now public state park have reported finding sealed tunnel entrances, unusual graffiti including messages like "Stranger help me" scrawled inside abandoned structures, and assorted odd documents left behind from the site's operational decades, artifacts that, whatever their actual origin, have only further blurred the line between the site's real Cold War history and the entertainment franchise it unintentionally inspired. Camp Hero isn't the only real, secretive government facility sitting near Montauk, and it's worth understanding its neighbor, because the two locations are frequently mentioned together in regional conspiracy culture despite having entirely separate, unconnected histories. Plum Island sits a few miles off the northeastern tip of Long Island, and has hosted a federal research facility since 1952, when it was operated by the U.S. Army Chemical Corps as part of the country's biological warfare program. Before that program was formally abolished by presidential directive in 1969, and the site was transferred to the Department of Agriculture. From 1954 onward, the facility operated as the Plum Island Animal Disease Center, dedicated to studying dangerous foreign animal diseases like foot and mouth disease that could devastate American livestock if ever introduced to the mainland, a mission the government maintained there until its research operations began transferring to a newer facility in Manhattan, Kansas. The island's genuine secrecy and restricted access have fueled their own persistent conspiracy theory, entirely separate from anything involving Montauk's own mythology. The claim that Lyme disease, first identified and named after an outbreak in nearby Old Lyme, Connecticut, in the 1970s, was either accidentally released or deliberately engineered as a biological weapon at the Plum Island facility, with infected ticks escaping and spreading the illness across the surrounding region. This theory has appeared in popular books, including a 2004 title called Lab 257, and gained enough political traction that a provision requiring the Department of Defense to investigate the claim was actually included in the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act passed by the House of Representatives. The scientific case against this theory is genuinely thorough and worth knowing in detail. Researchers Sam Telford and David Persing, publishing in the journals Science and the Journal of Infectious Diseases, tested preserved museum specimens of ticks and mice, and found that the Borrelia burgdorferi bacterium responsible for Lyme disease was already present in wildlife on the eastern end of Long Island as early as 1945, and in Cape Cod specimens dating back to 1894, decades before Plum Island's animal disease research program even existed, since the facility's predecessor wasn't activated until 1952. Telford has since publicly characterized the conspiracy theory as thoroughly debunked. Further undermining the theory, genetic analysis of the bacterium shows no evidence of a single geographic point of origin, which is precisely what researchers would expect to find if it had genuinely escaped from one specific laboratory. And the disease has since been documented across the upper Midwest, the Pacific Coast, and other regions entirely disconnected from Plum Island's location. As one biodefense researcher put it plainly when discussing the persistence of this theory, it reflects a broader, understandable human tendency to attribute complex, poorly understood public health problems to a deliberate conspiracy, rather than to the messier, less satisfying truth of urbanization, ecological disruption, and a genuinely ancient bacterium that had simply been circulating in American wildlife for centuries before anyone had the tools to identify it. In July 2008, a genuinely strange, real event added yet another layer to Montauk's already crowded mythology, and it's worth telling in full because it demonstrates, in miniature, exactly how these legends actually form in real time. On July 12th, a Montauk local named Jenna Hewitt and several friends, walking along Ditch Plains Beach, discovered the carcass of an unusual-looking animal. Pale, bloated, hairless, with what appeared to be a beaked snout and long, clawed fingers. Hewitt photographed it and shared the image with a local news outlet, which ran a small, tongue-in-cheek story under the headline, "The Hound of Bonnickville." The story might have stayed a minor local curiosity if not for a single, brief post on the popular blog Gawker on July 29th, titled simply "Dead Monster Washes Ashore in Montauk." The photograph did the rest of the work on its own, spreading globally within days and earning the creature its lasting nickname, the Montauk Monster. Theories about its origin multiplied almost immediately. Some speculated it was an unidentified new species. Others suggested a large dog, a sheep, a shell-less sea turtle, or an elaborate hoax constructed from latex. And given the region's existing reputation, a great many people immediately proposed that the creature had escaped, or mutated, from the nearby Plum Island Animal Disease Center discussed a moment ago. A theory that gained traction specifically because of the two locations' genuine geographic proximity, roughly 8 to 10 miles apart. Despite there being no actual connection between Plum Island's real research mission and the animal in the photograph. The scientific verdict arrived quickly and has held up consistently since. Wildlife biologist Jeff Corwin identified the carcass as a raccoon in a televised interview shortly after the photos went viral, and subsequent analysis by researchers, including vertebrate paleontologist Darren Naish, explained each of the specific details that had made the creature look so unfamiliar. The apparent beak was simply the exposed upper jaw and nasal cartilage left behind after the soft tissue of a raccoon's snout decomposes in water, a process that happens unusually early. Compared to other facial features, the seemingly elongated fingers matched ordinary raccoon paw proportions once the surrounding skin had shrunk away, and the total hair loss, initially cited as evidence against a raccoon identification, is a well-documented, ordinary effect of prolonged water exposure and decomposition, sometimes accelerated further by mange. Naish went so far as to overlay an illustration of an actual raccoon's skeletal proportions directly onto the viral photograph, demonstrating a close match point by point. What kept the mystery alive, more than any genuine ambiguity in the science, was a single frustrating detail. The actual carcass disappeared before any formal physical examination, DNA testing, or skeletal comparison could ever be performed. According to one local account, this happened because a nearby resident, disturbed by the sudden media attention, personally removed the remains and disposed of them in nearby woods, meaning the single most viral animal carcass photograph of 2008 was never actually examined by science directly at all, only debated at length from photographs alone. Additional Montauk monster carcasses, including at least one later identified as a decomposing cat, surfaced in subsequent years, each generating smaller waves of the same speculation. The original 2008 case remains, to this day, one of the clearest examples in modern internet history of how quickly an ordinary, explainable event, in this case a decomposing raccoon, can transform into an enduring piece of regional folklore simply through the combination of a striking photograph, a location with an already established reputation for government secrecy, and the simple, permanent absence of the one piece of physical evidence that could have settled the question immediately. This mythology's most direct modern descendant comes from a Washington attorney named Andrew D. Biago, whose claims researchers cataloging this genre have explicitly described as a direct successor to both the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project. Beginning in 2004, Biago began publicly describing his own alleged participation, starting at age 7 in 1968, in a classified program he calls Project Pegasus, which he says was jointly operated by the CIA and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, from 1962 to 1972. According to Biago's account, his father first introduced him to the underlying technology at a real aeronautical facility in Woodbridge, New Jersey, showing him a device consisting of two curved booms generating a shimmering energy field between them. Technology Biago specifically attributes to research originally developed by Nikola Tesla, drawing the same figure examined earlier in this episode directly into an entirely separate, later mythology. By age 7, Biago claims he was formally recruited as what the program called a chrononaut, undergoing what he describes as alpha intelligence training alongside other selected children, covering memory enhancement, surveillance techniques, and in one of his more disturbing specific claims, instruction in how to take a human life if the situation required it. Biago's subsequent claimed missions grew considerably more elaborate. He has stated that he was teleported to Gettysburg in 1863 and appears, he claims, in a genuine historical photograph from the battle. He has described extensive time travel to future dates, including the year 2045. And in his most widely discussed claims, he says that by the early 1980s the program's technology had progressed to actual interplanetary teleportation, and that he personally traveled to Mars on at least 2 occasions between 1981 and 1983 via what he calls a jump room, serving as part of an early ambassadorial mission to a Martian civilization. Biago has specifically named a young companion on these alleged Mars missions. A teenager he says was later known to the world as President Barack Obama, operating at the time under the name Barry C. Toro. A claim entirely unsupported by any independent evidence and consistent with a broader, separate body of unrelated conspiracy claims about the former president's early life. Biago's account of Mars itself includes descriptions of towering dinosaurs and humanoid beings he calls scorpion men, which he says preyed on humans who became lost on the planet's surface during these missions. It's worth pausing on the pattern connecting this story directly back to everything covered earlier tonight. Biago's claims share several specific structural features with Nichols and Bielek's original Montauk testimony. Technology explicitly credited to Nikola Tesla. Recruitment specifically targeting children believed to have heightened psychic sensitivity or adaptability. Memories publicly disclosed decades after the alleged events supposedly occurred, and zero independent government documentation, named third-party witness, or physical evidence beyond the claimant's own account. Biago has continued promoting these claims through interviews, self-published writing, and even a symbolic run for U.S. president, arguing that the government should formally declassify what he describes as decades of deliberately suppressed advanced technology. Like every other account examined across this entire episode, it remains in its entirety one person's testimony, extraordinary in its specificity, and entirely unverified by anyone beyond the man telling it. Nichols and Moon's original 1992 book proved successful enough to launch an extended series, and it's worth tracing how far the claims expanded across each successive volume. because the trajectory itself reveals something important about how this kind of mythology sustains itself commercially over time. The original book, The Montauk Project, Experiments in Time, ran a modest 156 pages through publisher Sky Books. Its 1994 sequel, Montauk Revisited, Adventures in Synchronicity, expanded the cast of alleged characters and claimed scope considerably, described by its own marketing as reaching far beyond the scope of the first book. The third volume, Pyramids of Montauk, Explorations in Consciousness, pushed the mythology into an entirely new register. According to this installment, researchers investigating the base discovered ancient pyramids at Montauk Point itself, positioned on what the book describes as sacred Native American ground, supposedly connecting the site directly to ancient Egypt, the lost civilization of Atlantis, the planet Mars, and the star system Sirius, folding in a single volume. Essentially every major thread of ancient astronaut and lost civilization theorizing this series has already examined in earlier episodes. The same book claims researchers discovered an actual nuclear particle accelerator hidden on the base, and introduces one of the mythology's most startling individual claims, that the real, historical death of James Bond novelist Ian Fleming in 1964 was somehow connected to the Philadelphia experiment, a claim the book's own back cover summary lists alongside its other chapter topics without further specifying any supporting evidence. A fourth volume, titled The Black Sun, Montauk's Nazi-Tibetan Connection, expanded the story once again, this time incorporating claims connecting the entire project to occult Nazi research programs and Tibetan mysticism, themes that draw on a much older, separate body of pseudo-historical claims about supposed Nazi occult research that has circulated in conspiracy literature since at least the mid-20th century, now folded directly into the Montauk narrative as though it had always been part of the same continuous story. It's worth noting the pattern this progression illustrates plainly. Each successive volume in the series didn't simply add new details to an already established set of claims. It actively absorbed entirely separate, previously unconnected conspiracy traditions, ancient astronaut theory, Atlantis, Nazi occultism, a real novelist's actual historical death, into the same expanding narrative. This is precisely the same absorptive pattern this series observed with the Dulce base mythology's incorporation of reptilian theory, ancient astronaut claims, and MJ-12 material into a single sprawling story. A conspiracy mythology that continues selling books, it seems, tends to grow not by deepening its original claims with corroborating detail, but by widening its scope to absorb whatever other popular mystery happens to be circulating at the same cultural moment. A commercial and narrative logic considerably easier to trace than any electromagnetic time tunnel ever described within the books themselves. Every major witness examined across this entire episode, Nichols, Bielek, Swerdlow, Biago, has described their claims as recovered memories, surfacing well after the alleged events supposedly occurred. This is worth placing in its proper scientific context, because the broader question of whether recovered memories can be trusted became the subject of intense, genuinely rigorous research throughout the very same decades this mythology was forming, in what researchers came to call the memory wars. Recovered memory therapy emerged as a prominent clinical approach during the 1980s and into the 1990s, built on the premise that traumatic experiences, particularly childhood abuse, could become buried in the unconscious mind and later retrieved through techniques including hypnosis, guided imagery, and dream interpretation. The approach gained enormous cultural traction, and by 1989, Washington became the first state to pass legislation specifically allowing people to sue over childhood abuse within 3 years of first remembering the incident, with 18 more states following suit within just a few years. The scientific pushback arrived directly from Elizabeth Loftus, a psychologist who had already built a substantial research career studying the malleability of eyewitness memory. In 1994, she published The Myth of Repressed Memories, arguing that a therapist's own confident belief that a client had experienced abuse could inadvertently lead that client to construct a detailed, sincerely felt false memory during the therapeutic process itself. Loftus went on to develop a specific experimental method for demonstrating this directly, successfully implanting entirely fabricated childhood memories in research subjects, including a false memory of having been lost in a shopping mall as a child, simply through repeated suggestion across a small number of guided sessions, with subjects afterward genuinely believing the fabricated event had happened. Some of the clinical cases that emerged during this same period illustrate just how far these recovered memories could be pushed. Loftus documented the case of a Wisconsin nurse's aide named Nadine Kuhl, who sought therapy in 1986 for an unrelated concern, and whose psychiatrist, using hypnosis and other suggestive techniques over time, helped her arrive at detailed memories of having been part of a satanic cult, of horrific abuse, and eventually of harboring more than 120 distinct personalities. A case now widely cited as a landmark example of how thoroughly suggestive therapeutic techniques can construct an elaborate, sincerely believed false narrative from essentially nothing. By the mid-1990s, the accumulating scientific skepticism had real, tangible consequences. Accused parents formed the False Memory Syndrome Foundation in 1992, assembling a board that included Loftus and other prominent memory researchers, and by the decade's end the organization had received assistance requests from more than 25,000 American families involved in cases built on recovered memory allegations. Expert witnesses associated with the foundation successfully challenged the admissibility of uncorroborated recovered memories in numerous court cases, including a significant 1996 ruling in New Hampshire that helped establish stricter standards for this kind of testimony going forward. None of this scientific history proves anything specific about what Preston Nichols, Bielek, or any other Montauk witness genuinely experienced internally. Their sincerity as individuals isn't the question at issue. What it does establish, clearly and with decades of rigorous supporting research, is that the human mind is fully capable of constructing detailed, emotionally vivid, and completely sincere memories of events that demonstrably never happened, particularly under conditions involving hypnosis, guided suggestion, or repeated exposure to an already existing narrative. Exactly the conditions present in nearly every witness account this entire episode has examined. If tonight's story has felt familiar in its shape, that's not a coincidence, and it's worth pulling one specific thread all the way to the surface, because it connects directly to two earlier nights in this very series. In 1979, a full 13 years before Preston Nichols ever published a word about Camp Hero, a writer named William L. Moore co-authored a book called The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility, credited alongside a co-author whose name should sound immediately familiar, Charles Berlitz, the same author whose 1974 bestseller The Bermuda Triangle we examined at length earlier in this series, and who had already sold more than 10 million copies worldwide, linking the Bermuda Triangle to his own separate, extensively promoted claims about the lost city of Atlantis. Moore and Berlitz's 1979 book took Carl Allen's originally strange, unverifiable letters to Morris Jessup and packaged them into a polished, marketable narrative, posing the same kind of rhetorical questions Berlitz had already used to great effect in his earlier Bermuda Triangle writing, asking pointedly why surviving crew members were reportedly discharged as mentally unfit, why a researcher connected to the project met an unexplained death, and explicitly, remarkably, suggesting a direct connection between the Philadelphia experiment and events in the Bermuda Triangle itself, weaving Berlitz's two signature conspiracy franchises into a single shared mythology. The book proved successful enough to inspire a 1984 science fiction film adaptation, produced on a $9 million budget and released by New World Pictures. The same film whose viewing, according to his own account, triggered Bielek's sudden recovery of memories connecting him to both the Eldridge and camp hero. William Moore's own career reaches even further into this series than his Berlitz collaboration alone. This is the same William Moore who partnered with Air Force Intelligence Officer Richard Doty in the deliberate disinformation campaign against Paul Benowitz, examined in detail in this series episode on Dulce Base. The same Moore who publicly admitted, at a 1989 UFO research conference, to having fed Benowitz fabricated documents as part of that operation. Moore additionally co-authored The Roswell Incident with Berlitz in 1980, a book that did more than perhaps any other single publication to relaunch the Roswell case as a modern conspiracy phenomenon, more than 3 decades after the original 1947 event. One man, in other words, sits at the direct authorial or operational center of the Bermuda Triangle's most successful book, The Philadelphia Experiments Founding Modern Text, The Roswell Revival, and a documented, admitted government disinformation campaign that helped seed the entire Dulce Base mythology. 4 of this series' major subjects, converging through a single collaborator, working across 4 decades, whether as a credited author, an uncredited disinformation operative, or both. Simultaneously, it's worth sitting with what this actually demonstrates about how these mythologies took their modern shape. This wasn't 4 entirely independent mysteries, each separately discovered by different researchers working in isolation. A comparatively small number of writers, publishers, and, in at least one well-documented case, an active intelligence officer, were repeatedly involved in shaping, packaging, and cross-promoting several of the 20th century's most enduring conspiracy narratives, often borrowing techniques and even specific rhetorical questions from one book to sell the next. It's worth taking a genuine detour into real, mainstream physics before we continue, because the question of whether time travel is possible at all turns out to be considerably more interesting and more scientifically legitimate than Nichols's claims about a radar tower ever needed it to be. Time travel to the past isn't automatically dismissed by serious physicists as pure fantasy. Albert Einstein's own theory of general relativity, published in the early 20th century, describes space and time as a single flexible fabric capable of curving under the influence of mass and energy. And under sufficiently extreme conditions, the mathematics of that theory permit a structure called a closed time-like curve, a path through space-time that loops back on itself, allowing a traveler moving continuously forward through their own experience of time to nonetheless arrive back at an earlier point in the universe's actual history. The first serious mathematical model demonstrating this was developed in 1937 by Scottish physicist W. J. van Stockham, involving an infinitely long, extremely dense rotating cylinder that would theoretically drag the surrounding fabric of spacetime along with its rotation. In 1949, the mathematician and logician Kurt Gödel, a close friend and colleague of Einstein's, produced an even more famous solution, a complete, mathematically valid model of an entire rotating universe in which closed time-like curves exist as a natural feature, meaning travel into the past would, in Gödel's specific model, be theoretically achievable simply by traveling far enough along the correct path. Physicists broadly agree that Gödel's universe genuinely satisfies Einstein's equations. It just doesn't appear to describe the actual universe we live in, which shows no evidence of the large-scale rotation his model requires. The most publicly recognized serious proposal came in 1988, when physicists Kip Thorne and Michael Morris at Caltech, working with Ulvi Yurtsever at the University of Michigan, published a paper in the prestigious journal Physical Review Letters proposing that a wormhole, a theoretical shortcut connecting 2 distant points in spacetime, could, under the right conditions, be engineered to function as a genuine time machine, with time passing at different rates on either end of the connection. There's a catch that has kept this proposal firmly in the realm of theory rather than engineering. Stabilizing a wormhole large enough and stable enough to be traversable would require what physicists call exotic matter, possessing genuinely negative mass and energy, a form of matter that has never been directly observed to exist in any usable quantity, and that most physicists doubt could ever be produced or harnessed at the scale required. Stephen Hawking, for his part, proposed something he called the chronology protection conjecture, suggesting only half-jokingly that some undiscovered law of physics likely prevents closed time-like curves from ever actually forming in our real universe, specifically because their existence would create serious logical paradoxes, like the classic problem of a time traveler preventing their own birth. Even physicists who take closed time-like curves seriously as a mathematical possibility broadly agree that no one has found any evidence they actually exist in our observable universe, and that even if they did, the energy requirements involved would sit many, many orders of magnitude beyond anything remotely achievable with current or even plausible future human technology. None of this, not Van Stockham's rotating cylinder, not Gödel's universe, not Thorne's wormhole proposal, bears any meaningful resemblance to Preston Nichols's claimed mechanism of modifying a conventional 1958 Cold War radar array to broadcast at specific frequencies between 410 and 420 MHz. Real theoretical time travel, as taken seriously by working physicists, requires either astronomical rotating masses, genuinely exotic negative energy matter, or gravitational conditions found nowhere on Earth's surface. Not an upgraded radio transmitter, and certainly not a single man's amplified psychic concentration. It's a useful, concrete illustration of the gap running through this entire mythology. Real physics does leave a door open, mathematically, to the idea of time travel. It just requires energies and materials that have absolutely nothing in common with anything ever actually installed at Camp Hero, Montauk Air Force Station, or anywhere else on the eastern tip of Long Island. It's worth stepping back from Camp Hero itself and spending some time with the actual town surrounding it, because Montauk's real history reveals a settlement with its own long, genuinely eventful past. One that absorbed wave after wave of outside interest without ever fundamentally losing its own character, a pattern worth understanding before we return to the conspiracy at its center. Long before European contact, the eastern tip of Long Island was governed by the Montauk Confederation, an indigenous nation whose name the modern town still carries. Dutch explorers first recorded contact with the Montauk in 1614. In 1658, English colonists established Deep Hollow Ranch on the same land, now recognized as the oldest continuously operating cattle ranch in the United States, predating the more famous ranching traditions of the American West by well over a century. The Montauk Point Lighthouse, authorized by an act of Congress in 1792 and completed in 1796, remains one of the oldest lighthouses in the entire country. Personally commissioned under President George Washington's administration, specifically to guide ships safely around the treacherous currents at Long Island's eastern point. In 1898, Montauk briefly became the center of national attention when Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders Regiment, freshly returned from the Spanish-American War, were quarantined at a camp called Camp Wyckoff on the same peninsula that would later host Camp Hero, while military doctors monitored the returning soldiers for yellow fever and other tropical diseases picked up during the Cuban campaign. It's worth knowing a darker chapter of this same period plainly. In 1910, New York state courts formally and falsely declared the Montauk Indian Nation legally extinct, a ruling used to strip the tribe of any remaining claim to ancestral land, despite the Montauk community continuing to exist, organize, and advocate for recognition throughout the 20th century and into the present day. A genuine historical injustice considerably more consequential and less discussed than anything, involving the base built decades later on the same land. The 1920s brought real estate developer Carl Fisher, the same man responsible for developing Miami Beach, who purchased 10,000 acres of Montauk in 1925 with ambitions of transforming it into the Miami Beach of the North, building the still-standing Montauk Manor Hotel in 1927 and an accompanying office tower. Fisher's grand development plans collapsed within a handful of years, undone by the 1929 stock market crash and a major hurricane, and Montauk quietly reverted to its older identity as a working fishing village. A pattern local historians have since described as the defining rhythm of the entire town's history. An ambitious outside vision arrives, briefly reshapes the landscape, and then the fishing village simply reasserts itself once the outside money and attention inevitably move on. That same pattern repeated itself again in 1971, when pop artist Andy Warhol and his longtime film collaborator Paul Morrissey purchased a secluded oceanfront compound called Eothen. Originally built in 1931 as a modest seasonal fishing camp for the wealthy Church family, the same family behind Arm and Hammer Baking Soda. Warhol's ownership transformed the property into an unlikely, low-key gathering place for major cultural figures of the era, hosting guests including Mick and Bianca Jagger, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, Liza Minnelli, and John Lennon, all of whom, according to Warhol's own circle, adopted a notably relaxed, unpretentious atmosphere once they crossed from the glitzier Hamptons proper into Montauk's still modest fishing village character. The property sold in 2017 for a figure reportedly approaching $85 million, an almost unbelievable increase from Warhol and Morrissey's original 1971 purchase price of roughly $225,000. What's genuinely striking, placed alongside everything else covered in this episode, is how thoroughly Camp Hero's own conspiracy mythology fits this exact same absorption pattern the town has repeated for centuries. A dramatic outside story. First Carl Fisher's resort ambitions, later the Air Force's Cold War radar mission, and finally Preston Nichols's elaborate mythology, arrives, generates enormous attention for a period, and Montauk itself, the actual working town with its actual centuries-deep history, simply continues on beneath it, largely unchanged by any of it. After decades of speculation about sealed tunnels and hidden underground levels, it's worth knowing that this question has actually received a formal, documented government answer. Not through any dramatic revelation, but through the same kind of unglamorous environmental paperwork that so often turns out to hold the real answer in stories like this one. Camp Hero falls under a federal program called Formerly Used Defense Sites, managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which requires environmental remediation review of former military properties before they can be safely used for other purposes. In 2019, the Corps conducted a comprehensive remedial investigation across the property's full 755 acres, sampling soil, sediment, surface water, and groundwater at multiple designated areas of concern, and explicitly mapping and assessing every accessible facility on the site, including the sealed bunkers and tunnel entrances that have fueled so much of tonight's mythology. The investigation did find real contaminants, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons associated with historical fuel storage and ordinary radar equipment operation, though these were ultimately assessed as falling below any meaningful risk threshold. Crucially, the investigation's own findings explicitly stated that it revealed no undocumented underground complexes, no experimental equipment, and no residue indicative of any activity beyond conventional military use. That process concluded in 2022, when the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation issued a formal, no further action determination, affirming that the site's remediation had addressed every identified hazard from its genuine military history, without uncovering anything supporting the broader mythology built around it. This wasn't the first time officials had documented conditions at the site, either. A 1985 environmental inventory report, filed years before Nichols ever published his book, described the actual physical state of Camp Hero's underground and enclosed structures in plain, bureaucratic detail, recommending that certain large bunkers be sealed specifically because they contained deep, 17-foot gun emplacements considered genuinely dangerous to trespassers, and that the entrances to the radar tower itself be secured because the site had already become a magnet for unauthorized visitors, with deteriorating fencing and loose equipment posing a real safety hazard on the roof. These are the same welded doors and sealed passageways independent explorers have cited for years as evidence of a cover-up, documented years in advance as ordinary safety measures addressing a decaying, publicly accessible former military site, for reasons having nothing to do with concealing any experiment at all. The formal FOIA record tells a similarly consistent story. Over more than 3 decades, journalists, historians, and private researchers have filed public records requests with the Department of Defense, the Air Force, the Navy, and nearby Brookhaven National Laboratory, searching specifically for any construction plans, funding records, duty rosters, or documents referencing a Montauk Project, time displacement, or related terminology. Every response has come back the same way. No matching records located. FOIA offices have released radar staffing documents, environmental cleanup reports, and standard base closure summaries, routine administrative paperwork, and nothing resembling any of the specific claims made in Nichols's books. None of this has meaningfully slowed the site's ongoing mythology, and it's worth understanding why plainly, one final time. Urban explorers who've entered restricted areas over the years, including researcher Brian Minnick, who explored the radar tower before the site opened as a formal park, have consistently reported finding sealed doors and old paperwork, but never anything definitively proving the specific claims Nichols made, and even the most dedicated modern investigators, like Camp Hero researcher Christopher Garetano, openly acknowledge that officials maintain there's simply nothing underground worth finding while still personally suspecting there might be. That gap between a thorough, multi-year, federally documented environmental investigation finding nothing and individual visitors continuing to feel certain something remains hidden anyway, is, in the end, the same gap this entire episode has walked through again and again, in one form or another, at every single site we've examined. Before we close tonight, it's worth spending a few final minutes with the one piece of evidence that should have settled the Philadelphia experiment's factual status from the very beginning. The actual, official U.S. Navy service record of the USS Eldridge herself, preserved in her deck log and war diary and held today by the National Archives. The Eldridge was a real Cannon-class destroyer escort, laid down in February 1943, launched that July, and commissioned on August 27, 1943, named for Lieutenant Commander John Eldridge, Jr., a naval aviator killed in action during the Solomon Islands campaign the previous year. Naval historians reviewing her deck log directly, at the specific request of researchers investigating the Philadelphia experiment claims, found something that directly contradicts the entire legend's timeline. After commissioning, the Eldridge remained in New York and Long Island Sound only until September 16, 1943, when she sailed to Bermuda for training and sea trials, remaining in that area until October 15, when she departed in a convoy back toward New York. The alleged October 1943 experiment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard would have needed to occur during precisely the window when the Navy's own official records placed the ship training near Bermuda, hundreds of miles away, rather than anywhere near Philadelphia at all. Her subsequent, genuine wartime service was entirely conventional and, by all accounts, honorably performed. Between January 1944 and May 1945, the Eldridge completed 9 full convoy escort voyages across the Atlantic, safely delivering personnel and war material to Casablanca, Bizerta, and Oran in support of Allied operations across North Africa and Southern Europe. She then transferred to the Pacific Theater in the war's final months, making contact with an unidentified underwater object en route to Saipan in July 1945 and immediately attacking it, though no results were ever confirmed, before serving out the war's final weeks on escort and patrol duty around Okinawa. The Navy's own official history center has stated plainly, after repeated searches of its archives, that no documents exist confirming the Philadelphia experiment ever took place, or indicating any Navy interest in attempting anything resembling it. The ship's later life was equally unremarkable by any standard beyond the myth eventually attached to it. Decommissioned in 1946, the Eldridge was sold to Greece in 1951 and recommissioned under the Hellenic Navy as the Leon, serving that nation for more than 4 decades before her final decommissioning in 1992, and she was ultimately sold for scrap in 1999. Meaning the ship at the center of one of the 20th century's most enduring conspiracy theories spent the second half of her operational life serving an entirely different navy, under an entirely different name, doing entirely ordinary Cold War-era naval duty, thousands of miles from Camp Hero, while an increasingly elaborate American mythology continued to grow around a few strange letters written more than a decade after she'd already been reassigned. We've traveled a long way across Long Island tonight. Let's gather the full shape of it before we close. We began with Camp Hero's genuine, entirely documented history, a disguised coastal defense base, a real SAGE radar tower, decommissioned in 1981 and left standing empty for 2 decades before ever opening to the public. We trace the Philadelphia experiment back to its true origin, not a Navy record, but a series of strange letters from a man named Carl Allen, amplified by a small, puzzling act of Navy engagement that gave the story a lasting, undeserved air of legitimacy. We followed Morris Jessup to his own genuinely tragic end, and Preston Nichols's decision, decades later, to graft an entirely new legend about Camp Hero onto that older, already unraveling story. We examined the Montauk Chair, Duncan Cameron's claimed psychic abilities, and the specific, recurring pattern by which each new witness, Bielek, Swerdlow, Biago, recovered their own memories only after encountering someone else's account first. We found the real MKUltra program sitting directly behind the culture's willingness to believe any of it, and we found real documented science, Elizabeth Loftus's decades of research into false memory, and general relativity's own genuine, if wildly impractical, allowance for closed time-like curves, explaining exactly how sincere people can come to believe, in vivid detail, things that demonstrably never happened, and exactly how far real theoretical time travel sits from a modified radar. Dish. We traced Nikola Tesla's genuine, unresolved historical mystery being borrowed wholesale for an entirely separate, invented one, and we traced Charles Berlitz's and William Moore's fingerprints across nearly every major mystery this series has covered, from Bermuda to Roswell to the Philadelphia experiment itself. We walked through the book series itself, watching its claims expand book by book to absorb Atlantis, Egypt, Mars, Nazi occultism, and the real death of a novelist, each volume selling briskly on the strength of exactly that expansion. And we found this legend's own children, so to speak, Andrew Basiego's Project Pegasus, and even Long Island's own Plum Island and its unrelated Lyme disease conspiracy, each borrowing the same basic shape. Real government secrecy, genuine scientific uncertainty, and a storyteller willing to fill the gap with something considerably stranger than the truth. What emerges isn't really a story about a haunted radar tower at all. It's a story about how thoroughly one 1992 paperback, built on a foundation borrowed from a 1955 hoax, could reshape an entire region's identity, spawning a hit Netflix series, a real lawsuit over creative ownership, a viral raccoon carcass reinterpreted as a monster, and a small library of increasingly baroque sequels. Decades after the base itself went quiet and its buildings were simply left standing, disguised as a fishing village nobody ever really lived in. And we found at the very end a genuine federal environmental investigation, completed as recently as 2022, that formally mapped every sealed bunker and tunnel entrance on the property and found nothing beyond ordinary Cold War contamination. The same unglamorous, bureaucratic paper trail that has quietly answered so many of this series' mysteries, for anyone willing to go looking for it. Camp Hero is still there tonight, its rusting tower still visible from the beach, now formally cleared by the state that owns it, and still, despite all of that, treated by a steady stream of visitors as though something remains hidden beneath it regardless. Whatever the truth turns out to be, the legend itself has clearly earned its own kind of permanence. There are other fences, other radar towers, other quiet edges of the map, waiting for other nights. We've already walked the waters of the Bermuda Triangle, the wilderness of the Alaska Triangle, and the mesa above Dulce earlier in this series. Somewhere ahead, we'll spend a night with the biggest question of all. Not just one base or one chair or one supposed portal through time, but the far larger question of whether anyone else is out there in the universe at all, and what it would actually take scientifically to ever know for certain. You don't have to remember any of it tonight. That's what tomorrow night is for. This has been the Sleepy Scholar. Sleep well.